Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Her Faith Inspires podcast, where we take cultural issues and we come at them with biblical truth. I have I say it's a fun episode because I'm looking forward to this conversation. I'm sure by the title of the episode, you know that we're going to dive into some pretty heavy cultural issues of our time in the time that we're living in, the things that we're facing as moms, as parents, maybe even just walking down the street, watching the news. These topics are in our face. How do we handle them as Christians? I have a guest on today. It's Emily Morales. She graduated summa cum laude from California State University, Fresno. Fun fact, that's my alma mater. I went to Fresno State as well. We'll tell you more about this in a few minutes, but let me finish introducing you to Emily. She graduated with a BS in molecular biology and a minor in cognitive psychology. As an undergraduate, she conducted research in immunology, microbiology, behavioral and cognitive psychology, scanning, tunneling, microscopy, and genetics, having published research in the Journal of Experimental Psychology and projects in scanning, tunneling, microscopy, having recently completed an MED from University of Cincinnati and a certificate in apologetics with the Talbot School of Theology at Biola University. Hello. Emily is currently an instructional designer, content developer for Moody Bible Institute, teaches organic chemistry and physics, and writes for Salvo Magazine. As a former Darwinian evolutionist, Emily now regards the intelligent design arguments more credible than those proffered by Darwinists for explaining the origin of life. Emily, I'm so excited to have you on. So we have a couple things to talk about, but what do you do in all that spare time that you have? I mean,
I
you're
know
not busy, are you?
I'm a big slouch, so I don't know. There's so much time on my hands.
I love it. I'm like reading this and I know I read through it as we started talking about this like early May, maybe even before that. And I'm like, oh my gosh, she's so like, you have such a great foundation of knowledge. And I love that, this former Darwinian evolutionist. And I love that you're more convinced that God exists and things like that. But one of the things that we started to realize as we're going back and forth, well, how I realized this was when I was reading your bio for the first time. I'm like, oh my gosh, Fresno State, like who says that? Nobody else on my podcast. You're my first guest from Fresno, and we didn't plan this.
Yeah, go Bulldogs, though, right?
Go dogs. That's right. That's right. That's fun. Yeah, that's something that, I mean, we were even talking before we recorded, the hospitals my kids were born at, your kids were born in Fresno as well. And neither one of us live there anymore, but
Yeah,
small world. Like
very small world.
yeah,
Very small world.
you
Yeah,
realize how small it is when you move out of the place that you came from, and then you realize people have all these connections. It's
yeah.
super fun. I mean, I'm blown away by that. I'm sure I'll be blown away by other things in this podcast episode after we're done recording it, but I'm still blown away that we both went to Fresno State, and that's pretty fun. So
Yes.
I love your testimony, and I want to get into that before we talk about all of the other things like with the furries and the trans issue and stuff like that. But you have a fascinating testimony of how you switched from believing in this Darwinian evolution to intelligent design, which I want to tell people, I don't talk about the cosmological argument and things like that and the design argument as much on my podcast, which is great that you're here because we can talk about, how all of this is connected. But that's one of the things in apologetics that helps us when we talk to people about God. We go back to the beginning and why we can look around at creation and say that God, that this is an effect of a greater cause. And so you realize this, but you started from Darwinian evolution, like that's where you were. Can you tell us a bit about that, like that experience and how it laid the groundwork for the rest of this conversation? I think it's important.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I started embracing Darwinian evolution as a Christian. So, and I did not grow up in a Christian home. Actually, my dad was a Marxist atheist, and my mother was a mystic. And so none of us, I'm one of eight, and none of us ever, well, I don't know about my older siblings, but I can definitely say that my parents never took me to church. And those conversations in the home were hardly frequent at all. So we did grow up hearing a lot of philosophy. My dad loved reading all the great philosophers. And so when I became saved at the age of about a week before I turned 19. And then just some things happened in our church experience that really and maybe it's the reason why a lot of people deconstruct. I viewed the church as not having answers. I wanted to really get a full-bodied worldview as to why things are the way they are in the world. What is the purpose of man? What is the definition of life? Where did it all come from? And in the church circles that we were running with at the time, they did not have a well thought out worldview. And when I started really embracing Darwinism, really studying its claims and falling prey to it, nobody in our church orbit even had an intellectual retort. No one could say, Darwinism, why are you following this? The science and the data is not strong for Darwinism. There was not a single voice that could do that. And what is amazing is that Darwinism is such bad science today. I'm actually embarrassed when I look back at myself up until just a few years ago, and I just think, wow, I actually believe this. Why would I possibly believe this? Because the science is so bad. And really, I was met with quips like evolution is evolution, and you believe we all came from monkeys. And I would hear the narrative about how Darwin repented of everything he wrote on his deathbed. And I still don't know that that claim is true to this day. But indeed, that's the sad thing, is that we were in a very unintellectual, and I don't say this to be uppity at all, but there was no apologists around us that could actually stop me from falling into Darwinism. And I embraced it. I thought that Darwinism had an answer for everything. What was the evolution of virtue? What was the evolution of evil? What is the evolution of hospitality? What is the evolution of our idea of beauty? What is the evolution of coerced sex or rape? Evolutionists had an answer for this. And for every single thing I could ask, evolution had an answer. And I love the fact that the evolutionists fearlessly pursued these answers. And like, what is the evolution of sexual reproduction? Has anyone ever asked, why are we not all just reproducing vegetatively, like asexual reproduction? Why is there sexual reproduction, like, separate gametes coming from, a female side and a male? Evolutionists answered this. I think they came up with an answer that it was because we had to have immune systems. Offspring had to have immune systems that were a little bit different from their parents in order to meet the pathogens, in their environment. I mean, evolutionists answered so many of these questions for me that I did not see answered in the church. So I fell headlong into evolution and Darwinism. Now, what is interesting is my program was in molecular biology. And in molecular biology, we examined the molecular, the atomic substrates by which evolution is said to act. They say that evolution acts on, it's purely blind, it's random, and it's purely materialistic. And the way that we get, new structures, new innovations in nature, if we're talking about a pentadactyl limb, or if we're talking about the camera eye that we have, they say that these structures arise by mutations on DNA. So I remember being in my genetics, I did take several genetics courses, and I remember being in my genetics course and looking at how complex DNA replication is, how complex RNA transcription is, or going from RNA to protein. They call it translation. I remember looking at how complex all of these seemingly simple operations were in the cell. And I remember at the time thinking, wow, I'm not quite sure how purely random, blind material processes could give rise to this. That was enigmatic, but I was a hopeful Darwinist. And I thought, well, the smartest people I know, these guys are all believing in evolution, so it must be true. And I had to say that in my pursuit to know everything, I amassed a Darwinian library of between 80 to 100 books. Now, that may not sound like very many books to a lot of people, but I read almost every one of them, because I read Dawkins. I read all Franz de Waal. I read all of these people. just really in an effort to know. I just wanted to know everything about the world, and I wanted to understand, a worldview, to get a worldview. But really, it came down to this: my skepticism of Darwin. It came to a head when I was just not seeing how, from a molecular perspective, how Darwinism was even tenable. So one day I went on the internet, and this was probably about 7, 8 years ago. I went on the internet looking for some animations of cells. And I remember coming across a video that Michael Behe was in. And Michael Behe is a biochemist who is at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. And Michael Behe said, he said, I always came to understand that, evolution was responsible for life and for everything that we see, for the diversity of species. And he said, and he confessed to having nagging questions, but and realizing that Darwinism was just not answering certain questions for him. So he started reading another evolutionary biologist, Michael Denton, who wrote a book that was Evolution, Theory of Evolution, A Theory in Crisis, I think was the name of Michael Denton's book. And when Michael Behe read Denton's critique of evolution and what evolution says it's capable of doing, Michael Behe admitted, he says, I had these very same questions. And yes, evolution cannot do the things that it claims to do. So I had a pretty hard heart at the time I was reading Michael Behe's book, and I was saying, show me the evidence. And Michael Behe outlines several metabolic pathways, how we process vision, how blood clots, the complement immunological pathway, protein synthesis. This was language that I understood. And microtubule formation. And this might not mean very much to many people, but to me, it was like, he's speaking my language.
Mm-hmm.
And, one day I was in a restaurant, and I don't cry very often. I'm not a very emotional person, but I was reading Michael Behe's book in the restaurant with my husband, and driving home, I just broke into sobs, and I said, God did it. God did it. God is responsible for life, for everything that we see. And this was really so revelatory to me, to see that. And it actually gave me a real healthy respect for the creator of the universe, just looking at these proofs.
Mm-hmm.
So that, and then shortly thereafter, I started looking at, I guess it was apologetics. I was unwittingly walking into the field of apologetics. And I then started exploring, origin of the universe, Big Bang, cosmogony.
Mm-hmm.
I started looking at apologetics that explained the origin of subatomic particles. And as I look at this, the fine-tuning arguments for the universe, I even to this day grow worshipful of the God who did all of this. And really, there's a healthy terror I have of God. It's like, yes, you are majestic, and you are to be praised and worshiped because of the things that you've made. And God's fingerprint is on the created order.
Yeah.
But our own hard hearts do not enable us to see it. I can say that as someone who was there.
Yeah. So do you think that growing up, if you would have gotten answers, if you would have had, answers that weren't, like you said, quips, that they were rooted in the evidence that points to God's existence rather than going and searching for it through the ones who provided answers, good or bad, they provided answers to your questions, whereas Christianity did not. Do you feel like that would have at least deterred you from going further into Darwinian evolution, or do you think that it would have kept you from it, or do you think you may have gone into it and maybe not have stayed as long? Like, I know you won't know that because that's not what happened, but knowing now, what do you feel? How important is it that you would have gotten that information when you needed it?
I would have welcomed that information. I would have welcomed a biblical worldview as John Calvin really stated his theology really does have a full-orbed worldview. And this man named Abraham Kuyper really fleshed out. And a lot of people associate Calvin only with the doctrine of election, but Calvin said so much more in his Institutes of the Christian Religion. He said so much more than just election. And Abraham Kuyper outlined and fleshed out John Calvin's worldview, which is really a biblical worldview. And if I would have had someone that knowledgeable who could have presented that argument to me, I think that things would have been different. I was honest. I was honestly looking for someone to fight back against these claims of Darwinism. And that's why I'm very sold on apologetics today, because I think things could have been different. I think my life would have been different. You know, I was in Darwinism for 2 decades, and I was in Darwinism when I was making decisions about how I was going to school my sons, whether I was going to raise them in church. You know, our church experience was so bad that that in my view, I thought if I raise my sons in church, I will be guaranteed atheist by the time it's all said and done, because the church had no answers. And we didn't raise them to not know about Jesus, but we were very intentional about not taking them to church. That's how unimpressed we were with the churches that we were involved with in California. And now, you know, we are now in a great Reformed congregation that has a robust worldview. You know, we catechize our children with the Westminster Confession of Faith, which answers, what is the sole purpose of man?
Mhm.
You know, it answers all these questions that you would be looking for a worldview to answer, and those were nowhere to be found.
Mm.
So, Shanda, yes, that very possibly could have made a difference.
Yeah.
We
Well,
would
it's
have
good that you were seeking the truth. I think seeking the truth and wanting to know what is true here, and recognizing when the worldview that you put your trust in ultimately just wasn't aligning to reality. So that's great. I pray that more people have that experience at least, but I also pray on the other hand that the church does its job and lays that foundation early on, because that's our responsibility as the church. And times are different. Whereas the country that we now are in used to value the Bible as God's word and God's authority. Like, that's what's different about America. We were founded on principles that came from a biblical worldview. And so now in the last, I don't know, it hasn't been that long. I mean, because, you know, I was saying one of my boys is graduating from high school, and when he started kindergarten, I wasn't having to worry about all of these transgender issues and this secular humanism like we are now. So the Bible has become, this country's become so post-Christian. The Bible's become this, you know, old book that is irrelevant to this day. We are having to approach, as Christians, we are having to approach the culture differently. And that's why it'd be like, well, why apologetics now? Why am I just hearing about this now? Because it's more needed to evangelize now. It's more needed to lay those foundations with our kids. It should be the Bible with apologetics, because we're talking about answering these questions, these worldview questions, that every worldview has to answer them. Like, every worldview has to answer these questions. This is not something that is isolated only to Christianity answering these worldview questions. It's just Christianity answers them best, you know. And so that's my plug for why apologetics now, kind of thing. So you write about the transgender ideology. We're going to switch gears a little bit here, which I think, in my opinion, who better to write about something like this than someone who's come from this naturalistic worldview, materialistic worldview, where you can say, okay, hold on a second, talking about the transgender ideology for Salvo Magazine, which I had Terrell on here a few months ago, and we had a great conversation too. Many people see, like right now, we're talking about Dylan Mulvaney a lot. He's been in the headlines lately. They see him as innocent. They see him as funny. This isn't harmful. Look at how innocent he is. And he's just, you know, kind of this cutesy little running around like a little 13-year-old girl. And they wonder like what the big deal is if he's the face of Maybelline or anthropology, and obviously Bud Light's rethinking what they did with that whole thing there. But you have studied this ideology, and you know that underneath these quote unquote harmless depictions of transgenderism, there is a much greater threat. Why should people, especially Christians, not remain neutral about this issue?
We cannot be neutral about this. We cannot be neutral, and we cannot be silent about this. You know, what underlies gender, this whole gender ideology? I want you to think about this. Well, let me back up for a minute. It's obvious to forward the argument, regarding WPATH, what WPATH does. WPATH is the World Professional Association of Transgender Health. So for a parent that has a child that comes to them and says, hey, mom, I'm a man in a woman's body, if it were me saying this, for example. Well, a lot of parents will go to WPATH's website in the same way we might go to the American Diabetes Association's website if we have a family member whose blood sugar is high. And WPATH posits itself as this objective body of medical information and presenting standards of care. They may not know that WPATH is run by a man named Marcy Bowers, who is posing as a woman, doing cosplay as a woman. Matt Walsh would say cosplay as a woman. And yeah, this is Marcy Bowers right now. And Marcy Bowers and the people who are running WPATH stand to make a lot of money with transgender surgeries, with prescribing puberty blockers, all of this. And so it's obvious for us probably to talk to even most Christians and to say, look at the genital mutilation that we're doing, to young people. This is horrible. We're sterilizing a whole generation. So this is a pretty easy apologetic. It's very obvious. We can, look at detransition stories. These are very apparent to us, but I am horribly concerned about the psychological damage that we're doing. And not just to these young girls and boys who are transitioning, it's mostly autistic girls that's doing this. But I'm saying, to the young children, like, here's a great question. When Ron DeSantis wanted to eradicate transgender ideology from the K-5 curriculum, why were people so up in arms? Why were the heads of Disney so up in arms over this? And, because, the idea was you don't do sex education until a kid's in 5th or 6th grade anyway. So why do you have a problem with this being in kindergarten? Well, because if you can insert that curriculum into children as early as kindergarten, you really psychologically damage them. And the damage isn't limited to them being gender questioning. The damage is the very first things that children understand are gender and age. So you ask any little kid, they see the world in very obvious binaries. Ooh, look at that stinky girl over there. Or, oh, look at that mean boy. I mean, children naturally see. It's one of the first bits of concrete information that they cling on to as when they're forming their cognitive development. It's boy, girl, grown up, and versus child. So here's what we're doing. We are destabilizing a very foundational framework for them on which they are understanding the world. We're destabilizing that. And we are teaching them at a very young age to question the whole framework on which they construct knowledge. This induces anxiety in little kids. It makes them anxious to say, wow, I thought the world was formed of these two categories, and it's not. Look how upset kids get when they realize there isn't a Santa Claus. For something as ridiculous as that, kids get pretty shaken up by that. Well, then we tell them there is no such thing as boy and girl. We are really putting a lot of psychological damage on them, inducing a lot of anxiety. So the question becomes this: why would we induce this kind of anxiety on K through 5th graders? And it's because this anxiety can really serve a purpose for other horrible ends. So it's intentional to make kids anxious. We look around at the data today at how many kids are reporting anxiety that a generation ago would have had someone institutionalized. We now have young people today living with anxiety and depression that it's crippling for them.
Yeah.
And so barring, the big things we see, like, having double mastectomies and, phalloplastic surgery, barring all of that, the psychological damage that's being done to kids because we're challenging a very basic framework on which they understand the world. This is a disaster, to do this to kids. And
Yeah.
it's intentional. And I would say parents, I don't need to talk so much. I do talk a lot. But parents, now is the time to say something. Don't stand in the sidelines. If something comes through, your kid brings home a paper that they're going to have drag queen story hour in your child's library. Don't stand on the sidelines and wait for another parent to say something.
Yeah.
You need to say something. Your voice is powerful. This is evidenced by what happened with Bud Light, what has now happened with Target.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Powerful.
Absolutely. Have you heard about the Surgeon General just coming out and saying, hey, parents, social media is harmful to your kids? And it's like, I don't know what the delay is. People could see this, we could see this happening. There's been study after study, especially of teenage girls and the harmful effects on social media. But he
Yes.
doesn't come out to say what about social media is causing this effect. Like, let's get real. When you're looking at social, it can't just be a social media platform. It's what they're looking at, what's happening on that platform. So they know if this is the effect that it's having on kids, just to say social media itself is such a blanket statement. What about what content are we talking about? What sources are we talking about that's pushing the content? And it, to me, I would say my first thought as a parent, because I have, my youngest is 13 this year, and I used to let my older two boys got a phone in the middle school because they started doing sports, and I was like, okay, call me after. But they didn't have like YouTube, they don't have social media apps and things like that. But this trans issue was not like, it wasn't what it was just a few years ago. It wasn't what it is today. So my 13-year-old doesn't get a cell phone. Like, I'm like, we're raising that age to 16 and we adjust as a family. It's not, and I told him this morning, I know that usually the youngest gets more. Like, by the time you got your third one, you're like, all right, you can have it. You could have whatever. I know your brothers had to wait, but you get more lenient, it seems, as time goes on. No way. Like, the culture has changed. We changed that standard to protect our children. But what did you hear that? And if so, what was your thought on that?
Well, it's amazing. And I would not expect, with our current administration really championing and saying that they are going to be advocates for transgender people. I would not expect that anyone is, under this administration probably is going to say anything about what is obvious, what is staring us in the face. It is transgender ideology in every form. It is dangerous. And yes, and that is, I would say that's principally the problem with social media, is that very thing. Girls, here's the trap that that transgender ideology sets up. And if my 13, I'm an autistic woman. And I did have gender dysphoria. I did. I was confused. I grew up with 5 brothers. I always played with boys on the playground. This is common for autistic girls to not have a strong feminine identity. But I did not have worm tongue whispering into my ear, you must be a lesbian or you must be transgender. I didn't have that. I just thought, okay, well, I'm just a different girl. I'm just a tomboy. And I was okay just being a tomboy. And my husband has said, you're a man in a woman's body, because I think like a scientist. I'm very logical and analytical, and I'll just, I'll kind of laugh about that. But I loved being a mother.
Mm-hmm.
I'm steering a little bit away. I don't mean to, but I thank God that transgender ideology was not around for my 13-year-old self, because I would have never enjoyed the love of a husband. I would have never had gone through motherhood and all the things that I absolutely loved that is associated with what is true womanhood. And if my 13-year-old self would have gotten on the internet, and this is how it all starts,
Mm.
these girls, there was a time, Shanda, probably when your sons were young, where you could say, okay, I don't want to live in this area because it's dangerous,
Mhm.
or because the crime rate is really high, or because the kids are smoking cigarettes as junior hires. And so you could move to a neighborhood to somewhat insulate your kids from the evils that were out there. Well, a parent can't do that anymore, because you can live in the best neighborhood, attend the finest church, the most doctrinally sound church, and if your kid has this thing in his pocket or
Mhm.
her pocket, she starts questioning, gee, am I really? I do don't like going through puberty. 13-year-old girl saying, my 13-year-old self saying, ooh, I don't like this puberty thing. I don't like it. I do feel like an alien in my body. And you look on the internet, and the internet, they will tell you, oh, you must be transgender. It must be that your true gender identity is that of male. And that would have been the story to me.
Mhm.
So it's horrible, because parents will find overnight, their kids will come to them with a full narrative. Well, if you're a girl, the daughter might say, well, mom, it's better to have a live son than a dead daughter. I mean, the transgender movement will give your kids all the talking points they need
Yep.
to get parents on board with their transition, and to even get psychologists on board and medical providers. It provides, these influencers know exactly what to say.
Mhm.
This is all part of social media.
Right. Right. Yes, exactly. So when it comes to like books in school libraries, because that's, now we're seeing this equivocation fallacy big time of, oh, it's we're banning books. And so when you look at the word banning, I mean, we're not talking about, and I want to tell the audience, equivocation is when you take a word and somebody means that word. It's kind of like a homonym, which is one word that has several different meanings, right? It's spelled and sounds the same, but it has different meanings, like a bat, a baseball bat, or a bat that flies, but banning is the same. Like if you can say, oh, we're not gonna allow this book into a library of elementary school kids because they're too young. Essentially, you are saying that book is not allowed here. But does that mean that book is banned in society? No. Book banning, as far as like, I always think of Fahrenheit 451, where they're burning the books and no one can read them. That is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about age appropriate content. And when kids are, like you were saying, cognitively able and developmentally able to take that information and be able to process it properly. And even so, there's some stuff I wouldn't even read as an adult that I've seen these things going around at these teacher parent conference meetings,
Board meetings,
board
yes,
meetings.
board
Thank you.
meetings.
So when
Yeah.
it comes to banning books in school libraries and teachers telling young kids that, gender is not binary, and that parents should be like nonchalant about these things, if this doesn't stop, where do you think it's going to go? Where is this end? Where does it end up? Because it's like we've seen, I find it odd that people don't see this escalation of events that started with, when you're talking about gay marriage, as the country, the White House goes red, white, and blue under Obama. I believe it was
Yeah.
like 2012-ish, 2013. Everybody's like, oh, just chill. We're just talking about gay people being able to get married. They're able to be on each other's insurances, cohabitate, have all the rights that regular married people have. And Christians that were paying attention, that were drawing a line in the sand, said, this is going to come with repercussions. This is a slippery slope that is going to continue to go on and on and on. Christians, I believe, the ones that have their finger on the pulse of culture, see that morality doesn't have an end. Morality will take you further and further along until you, at some point, you're like, wait, I didn't expect this. Well, you compromised step 1, and now we're down step 10, 15, 20 steps in or beyond. And guess what? Guess where we're at now? Now we're saying that boys can be girls, girls can be boys. And it's such a contradiction when you're saying gender is fluid, it's non-binary, but go ahead and transition to the opposite sex. You're acknowledging there that there is a difference, by the way, for people listening.
That's right.
Yeah. So it's like, where I'm just wondering, for you who studies this and looks more into it, are we talking about the legalization of maybe we see this minor attracted persons, like what we would say sexual abuse of children?
Yes. And politics always falls downstream of culture. So for any parents that are waiting for stuff to come up on the ballot, and they're saying, I'm going to show my disapproval by voting, you're too late.
Yeah.
You're too late. If it's an issue on the ballot, you're too late.
Mm.
So yes, there is a problem with this, and it's not going to end. So, I would encourage for anyone who can take, James Lindsay is a really great co-belligerent with the Christian movement, really trying to wake America up to the cultural Marxism that we are watching today. A lot of people hear the term Marxism and they think, oh, shared national resources, or, the government possessing all the capital and the assets in a society. That's certainly going on right now. But what is going on, truly going on with the transgender issue, drag queen story hour, with all of this, it is a cultural Marxism.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to really stand up to this now, because it's only going to get worse.
Yeah.
Now, regarding books banned in the library, I would challenge any parent, really anyone who's listening to this. I got Twitter. I'm hardly ever on social media. I got Twitter for the purpose of signing up for Libs of TikTok.
Mm-hmm.
That was the reason why I went on Twitter, was to see, and all Libs of TikTok is doing is, she was initially just posting what school teachers were saying. School teachers were openly posting, these videos, and she was simply, saying, hey, parents, this is going on in this district. And I would encourage parents, I make myself look at what these crazy people are doing. It hurts. It hurts to look at what W. Path is advocating. It hurts, when she posts pictures of the books that are being presented in libraries to children. They are pornographic. They are blatantly pornographic. They are books that, and I make myself look at it as much as I can tolerate. It's hard to read it because it's so horrific. And I'm an old lady. I'm an old lady, mother of 2 sons. But it's traumatizing for me to read these books even. Imagine what is happening to your children. These cannot be in the library. It takes but your child taking one glance at the images, and you think cartoons are not powerful?
Yeah.
Remind people of the study that Bandura did. He was a psychologist who looked at the impact on children who either watched violence being played out in a cartoon, in real life, or in a video. And he then measured which of those media had the most potent impact on children. It was cartoon.
Mm.
That was really a surprising find in Bandura's study. It was the cartoons. If you think that these written drawings are not pornographic and they're not going to sexualize your children, then you're wrong. You're really wrong.
Yeah.
So here's another thing that we need to all be aware of. And James Lindsay exposes so much of this. He's an awesome co-belligerent with us. James Lindsay was talking about how the whole idea, we in the West for right now treasure this idea called the innocence of childhood. We all say children are innocent. We need not burden them with the things that adults have to face. And James Lindsay has read papers written by these people who are contributing to alleged academic scholarship, who are saying, we need to rethink this. Why do we think that children should remain innocent? This is setting the stage for pedophilia. It's just, and we even now are calling them MAPS. We're calling them minor attracted persons.
Mm-hmm.
There is a group, look up, Prostasia is an organization that is saying they are fighting the abuse of children. I wrote about them in Salvo Magazine. They say we are fighting against the abuse of children. They have a very interesting definition of abuse. But in essence, what Prostasia is advocating, if you can, again, stomach their website, they are advocating pedophilia. And they're trying to, these boundaries where you don't touch children, you don't look at children a certain way. They're trying to remove these boundaries by saying that it's not fair. And this all comes under critical theory, critical race theory as well. It's all in this big umbrella of cultural Marxism.
True. Yeah.
Where one person may say, well, I didn't get to grow up under the protection of the innocence of childhood. I saw horrible things in my family. So why do you, as a privileged person, why are you so privileged that you can be shielded from these things that burden adults, like your inherent racism, like being touched inappropriately? They're trying to remove these boundaries. And we best take notice at what is happening, because they're trying to do away with the shame that is associated with pedophilia. First, they're going to try to do away with the stigma that's attached.
Yep.
And then it's going to become, this is all their psyops. And ultimately, we're going to see it start having some acceptance in the culture. We're going to be redefining sexual violation based upon consent. That's an interesting construct in of itself. We need to be vigilant.
Yeah.
And, parents, if there's drag queen story hour coming to your children's library, I would challenge every parent today, go into your children's school library and know if there's a way that you can go unannounced, that's best, and find out what books are in there. These are pornographic. These are really pornographic books that they're looking at.
Yes. I think it's a great point you make about calling them minor attracted persons, because the first thing we see is if we can change the language, we can change the stigma on that thing and not make it so bad. If you say everybody knows pedophilia has a negative stigma to it, so we don't want to use that word anymore. Let's change it to minor attracted persons. And we see the word consent all over the place. What is consent? This is, and in California, before we had left, on the day that this bill passed is the day I sent the text to my family saying we ought to move. It was in 2020, so it was an escalation of events with everything being shut down and all of these things. But one of the bills that passed was, if somebody within a 10-year span, say somebody's 23 and 13, they want to have a sexual relationship, as long as that 13-year-old consents to it, then we'll make that legal. And then each case by case situation will go before a judge to decide whether or not it was sexual abuse. And I was like, are you kidding me? Because as a teacher in a public school system, I've had students before where I would report some of the things that they would say, because they would rank teachers based upon how pretty they were and things like that. And I would take it straight to my VP and be like, this is what they're saying. You need to pull them into your office. I have nothing to do with this. And I will not have something pinned on me that I'm not involved in, because I wanted any look of something inappropriate. Like, a teacher will get put on leave. She will not be innocent until proven guilty. You know what I'm saying? It's like, if anything is accused about a teacher, they'll just be put on leave. And I'm like, I'm squashing this bug before it gets going. And so we would take care of it, because it was a middle school, and kids are kids. But my point in saying all of that is knowing how serious this is, and knowing that my boys were, a few years younger, but two of them were in high school at the time. I'm like, heck no. This is not okay, and so even then, even with the law, they're trying to move it around to where they bring in these loopholes. And it's not you have to say, who is this making it? Is it making it easier access from adult to children, or is it more protection for the kids? Well, that's easy. It's making easier access from the adult to the child. So it is not the protection of children. So if we stand by and we say nothing, then shame on us, shame on us for not doing it. And parents, I think we need to be so diligent to be watchful and listening and confronting and saying, your children, we are the first line of defense for our kids.
That's right.
And that's it. That's it. No one's going to love them more than we do, our own kids. No one's going to lay their lives down for my kids. So those are just things that we need to consider. But yeah, the first thing they do is change the language and
That's right.
let's get that negative stigma off of these minor attracted persons. And then that's how they're going to start pushing the boundaries back and make your little 5-year-old accessible to some perverts. And
Definitely.
it's like, it's disgusting. So
And they're going to couch it as there's this new term, and I learned about this. I also watch the Dark Horse podcast. So there's a couple of atheists that I watch because they really hit a lot of I'm hearing some really great arguments against all this cultural Marxism from classic liberals.
yeah.
And Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying had the Dark Horse podcast. And it's interesting because they are evolutionary biologists, but they were talking about how evil, they were using the term evil, because usually if you're a materialist,
Mm-hmm.
we're not making those types of designations. But one day, both of them said this is outright evil. And it is this idea that they are going to couch pedophilia, legalizing pedophilia under rights. And those rights are going to be the rights of the minor. You can't help who you love. And what are we going to do to protect the adult attracted minor?
Mm-hmm.
The adult attracted minor. Are you going to undermine, their ability to love whomever they want? So they're going to couch this whole issue with something like that.
Yeah.
And it is evil. It is absolutely evil.
How can you that's what I was saying. Like, you go back, and I actually heard this mom last year. We were on a field trip and she was saying, like, hey, I was all for allowing, for gay marriage, because I was like, okay, if they want it, let's give them that. But now look where we are. Like, at some point you have to stop. I'm like, that's the first problem that Christians don't get. That was the issue then. If you redefine marriage,
That's
because we're
right.
talking about, that's what we're discussing here. What is marriage? How is marriage, the institute of marriage? Where did it come from, and how is it designed? It's between a man and a woman, and what's its purpose? Then you redefine marriage to say, oh, okay, well, then it could be a man and a man and a man and a woman. If you redefine it from what it is, a man and a woman, then it can be anything. You can start marrying a relative. Oh, that's silly. Okay, well, guess what's come up? Those issues have come up. You can marry a child can marry an adult, and obviously that's the same. It just goes both different directions. You can marry an animal. Do you know that there are people marrying themselves? This is a
I
new thing.
saw that this week.
Yeah,
And
it's insane.
yeah. And you mentioned marrying a relative, and there are also papers being written where they're trying to destigmatize incest. And they are doing this under ableist accusations. So the argument is, why are you against incest? Well, for many reasons, but partly because oftentimes the children that are born are handicapped. Oh, you're an ableist, aren't you?
Mm.
So it's crazy, the language that these people are using. I will tell you what, God has stated a thesis in all of creation. He put a thesis out there before Adam. He said, tend this garden. You're free to eat of everything except this one tree. You shall not touch it or eat of it. And the antithesis was presented to Adam, that go ahead and touch it, you will be like gods. And I see where every single time God states a thesis, the idea of marriage being between a man and a woman, when society adopts the antithesis, there are problems. God's thesis is there is a gender binary in male and female. He made them. When we adopt the antithesis, there are repercussions every single time. And right now, we are seeing the ultimate experiment being played out in society, where if people are going to embrace that antithesis and they go against what God is saying, God gives his commands to us because he engineered us. He knows how we're made. He loves us. And when people are going to be so stiff-necked and hard-hearted that they're going to embrace the antithesis, there are going to be repercussions. And the repercussions today are sad, and they're very tragic. I would challenge your listeners, or to anyone who thinks transgenderism is okay, look up the detransition stories. Again, this isn't my make myself do. They are harrowing. I watch them and I will have nightmares after I watch them. They're horrible. This is not a position of love to affirm someone who is telling you that they are the gender they are not. That is not a position of love. That is a position of, oh, it's a horrible position. It's not a position that comes from love.
No.
And it's hard. I will tell you, if we look at what's been happening in schools, since the late 60s, we kicked God out of schools, in 1969, we threw God out of schools. And if we look at what is the aim of schools, it is to put a separation between parents and their children. I saw this when I took my son to public school and up in northern, I don't want to say where it's from, but when I took him in there, I remember my son sobbed when I walked away from the campus. And the nurse came right out and said to me, "You're a problem." She told me I was a problem. She says, "It is our job to break that bond between you and your son." And I thought to myself, that does not seem correct to me.
Yeah.
And that's one of the aims. And unfortunately, when your child as a first grader, goes into that first grade classroom and they are titillized, they're stimulated sexually, they can be. The guy who Muddy, who did all the experiments on infants, was able to get infants to orgasm, to be sexually aroused. People don't know this, but children can be sexually aroused. And this is why we have to protect them until they're at an old enough age where they understand the nature of this arousal. And when you take a first or second grader in a classroom and the teacher is talking about drag queen story hour, the child is going to start being aroused. They're going to feel weird. They're going to come home and tell their parents. Their parents are going to say, "Okay, this is not right." And they're going to be groomed by that school to view their parent as an enemy. Parents, please get involved. Please know what is happening in your kids' schools.
Absolutely.
And you have these teachers on the lives of TikTok, these teachers coming right out and saying to parents of first graders, "If your child comes in my classroom, it may be Susie in your home, but as soon as they come into my classroom, it's Greg."
Yeah. Yeah.
Coming right out and telling you what they're doing. Parents, believe them.
Yes.
This is happening.
Absolutely. They're not keeping it a secret. They're telling you what their agenda is. If we ignore it, then it's not just on us. It's at the expense of the child. Like we got to remember that. It's not just like, if you ignore it, that's on you. No, it's at the expense of somebody else, your children, which is to me is my best. Like the best thing that I have to offer the world is my 3 boys that I have poured into, prayed over, and God has given me to steward. And so that isn't worth it. It's not worth sacrificing.
No.
So yeah, we need to be paying attention. So I've recently heard of some news stories, and I think a lot of people have been hearing this. And not only have I heard these news stories, my kids, one of my boys goes to high school, the other one graduated already, but the other one's in middle school. And they identify, some of these kids wear these little tails. They'll wear these little bands with ears. They identify as like different, like fox or some other animal, and this is called a furry. So can you explain what a furry is and what you know about it? And what is this, what does this say about the current, where kids are in this current identity crisis in our culture?
It's really tragic. The furry fandom is really, it's a sad fandom. It's been out for a while, but I think it has become more mainstreamed because of transgenderism, to be quite honest. And a large percentage of the people in the fandom but certainly more than the general public, identify as an LGBTQIA++ member. And the fandom is really evil for many obvious reasons. And I would say all fandoms are a little bit strange because they can cause people to just become idolatrous, certainly, and to expend so much energy into things that are really not productive to advance in the kingdom of God. But the furry fandom is kind of unique because, yes, they do embrace a lot of fetishes. And they are very, very involved in kink, what is called kink. And I would caution any parent, if you have your kid towing the edges of an interest in being a furry, do not let them do it. For my own son, he's always been very entrepreneurial. He started a business when he was 11, a second one when he was 13. he's hitting about 17 and he's very creative. And he says, Mom, I found a way to make some money. And I said, oh, how's this? And he says, making costumes and suits for furries. And my older son said to me, don't let him do it. And I said, well, I hadn't really heard of these people. And this was several years ago. And my younger son says, yeah. He says, people pay a lot of money for these commissions. And I think this would be a great way for me to make money. So I started looking into the fandom, and I didn't see at that time, I didn't dig. I thought, okay, well, I said, well, what's your involvement in this? He says, oh, Mom, I know that a lot of them are very perverted, but he says, but there are others that are family friendly. Well, guess what, everybody? We all now know what family friendly is, don't we? But back, several years ago, I said, oh, they're family friendly. And I started looking up some of their stuff, and they use the term family friendly. And he says, Mom, I'm just going to go into this as an entrepreneur, just as someone, that they can commission to make suits. And I'm going to put all these stipulations that I will not make suits that are in any way going to be used towards sexual ends. And he came up with a whole statement, in this business model that he had. And he did get some commissions that were, besides from the fact that they were a little bit odd, there was nothing really untoward. But what this particular son found out when he was involved in this as an entrepreneur is that he was one night in a chat. He was actually publishing photographs of some commissions that he had done. And he was in a chat where they were talking about transgenderism. Isn't that strange in a furry community? And this one person, my son said, it appeared the person was maybe 12 or 13 years old. This one person had expressed skepticism over the fact that someone could change their gender just by a verbal fiat. And my son saw this community just dogpile this person. And my son stepped in there and he says, wait. He says, you are supposed to be an open community, a community that welcomes everyone. And they basically told my son to go pound sand. For this person, they had expressed that they were struggling with anxiety and suicidal ideation. And my son said, they actually told this person to go kill themselves. They actually cheered this person on, that they were they called them all kinds of names. And this really traumatized my son to see this degree of cruelty in this fandom. And he says, yeah, they are only open to you if you toe the line in every crazy thing they believe. And so he got out of the fandom. He finally, the last straw was when he went to a convention, and he never went to a convention without us going with him. And by this time he was an adult, and we still said, you're not going unless we're going with you. Mm-hmm. And we would always sit out in the lobby, and, he would go and participate in activities. And for the most part, it seemed just a little strange. But in the last convention he went to, it was highly sexually charged. And he came out of that convention, and overnight washed his hands of it. He said, these people are degenerates, and I never want anything to do with them again. And he completely abandoned this entrepreneurial effort. And so it is a sick fandom. I'll tell you, from a theological perspective, obviously we can address the perversion that is problematic. But to me, I kept saying to my son, aside from the perversion, look at the fact that, there's no other creature in the animal kingdom, in the kingdoms of life, that God designated as the Imago Dei. Mm-hmm. There's no one else has that distinction. What an honor that we have that distinction, being made, as it were, idols of God. That's why we're forbidden to cast idols, because we are idols of God. We are that material being that's made of carbons and proteins and carbohydrates. We are that fashioned object that looks like our deity. Mm-hmm. And no other animal in the animal kingdom can make that distinction. We alone enjoy that. What an honor to say that we are the image bearers of God. And this fandom looks at that and says, it sucks. It's not good enough. We don't want that designation. And again, it's embracing that antithesis of God's thesis. And there will be a special place, in eternity for these doctors who damage that imago Dei,
Yeah.
who actually put their hands on and destroy and sterilize that imago Dei. There will be a special place in eternity for these people that do that.
Yeah.
So yes, the fandom is wrong on so many fronts, but certainly in that regard, it is as well.
Yeah. Yeah. So looking at this, I like that you brought that spiritual aspect into it because it's a great point. I mean, they're trying to make themselves a lesser than created thing by attaching this identity to an animal. Or I've seen one that was really crazy. Like, I think it was a Twitter post. I'm not on Twitter, who identified as a wolf and howls, and it's just odd that you would choose an animal, when God has made you a being created in his image. And not only is everyone created in his image, once you give your life to God and you follow him, you become the temple that God abides in, which is so sacred. The tabernacle. Thank you. And so obviously there's a spiritual aspect of it, but what do these things say about the mental health of our society?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the mental health of, we touched on it earlier. I think the mental health of our society is it's sick.
Yeah.
We're hurting in our culture. And again, I don't think that this is accidental. When you have a totalitarian takeover, Mao did this in China. This is kind of an interesting bit of history. George Lukács, you had the Bolshevik Revolution happening in 1917. And George Lukács was a Hungarian man, and he wanted to spread that revolution in Hungary. So as the education commissar and cultural commissar, what did Lukács do? Lukács introduced in 1919 a sexualized curriculum for their earliest grades all the way through the end of their educational experience. Because Lukács knew if you could sexualize children, you make them very mentally fragile. If you make them, it's grooming. If you make them very mentally fragile, then you can have a total socialistic Marxist takeover. And I think this is by design. We're fragilizing our youth. Our youth are so fragile today. I think this was interesting. Jonathan Haidt had talked about this, trigger warnings, and how all these kids who were in universities when Donald Trump got elected, how they all had this trauma. And initially I was thinking, you little snowflakes, you guys can't handle anything.
Yeah.
But he pointed out, I think it was Jonathan Haidt that did this, that when they did MRIs on these kids' brains, they found that these kids who were so triggered over the election of Donald Trump, that they had trauma, that they had lesions in their own brains, that as though they went off to war and were in the throes of battle. They had the same lesions in their brains from an election. We are doing this to our young people. Social media is the worst culprit of all. I would say for anyone, if you want your mental health to be better right away, ditch the phone. Hey, parents, get your kids the flip phone and just make sure that they can't in any way have access to social media. Immediately they will feel better. We have over in our area this wonderful center called Linner Center of Hope. It's a big psychiatric facility. And one of the first things that they do when, and my son was an inpatient there. So unfortunately, the son who was involved in the furry fandom, because he, these people just did a real number on him. And the national response to COVID did as well. And one of the first things they do when they sign you in as an inpatient, they take your phone away. And if you are a guest going to visit that patient, you have to lock your phone up. There's a reason why they do this, because they know that phone really inflicts a lot of damage. Indeed, the mental health of our young people, it's horrible. I feel really bad. And and we can mock and snicker about them being snowflakes, they are truly damaged. They
Yeah.
are truly damaged because of what they're getting on social media.
Yes. We're not teaching kids how to think. And when we don't teach them how to think, we don't teach them how to evaluate things that are true. And looking at the truth doesn't care how you feel.
That's
It's
right.
presented, and we have to be able to handle that when it doesn't align to what I want, if it makes me feel bad. I mean, we have to realize, and I remember I'm teaching kids logic in the fall, and I was talking about this. There are times when someone comes to you with the truth and you may weep over it, like, hey, grandpa passed away. That is a true statement. It doesn't feel good, but you can't avoid it because it's reality. And we're talking about these, kids, like you said, I mean, they need these emotional therapy dogs and things like that. They need safe spaces.
That's right.
We are not doing our kids any good by not teaching them how to process information, how to face the truth, how to face differing ideas, how to talk to people with different disagreements. And it's not being led by what I feel or the emotions. It's looking at the truth and saying, what is the outcome of this going to be if I deny the truth? Because that is going to hurt me. That is going to be damaging. So they don't even know the real consequences of, and it's a scary thing, because I think those studies are fascinating. And even with social contagions, right now we see that 25% of Gen Z is identifying as LGBTQIA, blah, blah, blah.
That's right.
And they're saying it's a social contagion. And I heard one psychologist, and I'd have to look into the facts of this, but it was fascinating. He said, if you take that phone away from a kid who is saying they're transgender, and because it's a social contagion, after a couple of weeks, they will correct. They'll go, they won't be identifying as that anymore.
A couple weeks is all it takes. That's interesting.
I could be wrong on the timing. Like, I have to go back and listen to it, but he was saying within a certain time frame, and it didn't seem to be that long. He was like cutting it off.
Wow.
They will redirect course because it is a social contagion, and it's those sources on their social media that's feeding them this. Because
right.
You're a hero if you identify as the opposite sex.
Yeah.
You're brave, you're bold, you're coming out, and people are going to applaud you. So they want something meaningful and purpose. So they're looking at that. And it's a sad reality.
And the bad thing is in our culture right now, we have an incentive structure that really rewards people who will be LGBTQIA plus plus plus.
Yeah.
I don't know all the letters are anymore, but yeah. If you either become that or you become an ally of that. We have a system in our culture right now that rewards that, an incentive system that does that.
Yeah.
And that's the bad thing. You don't have an incentive structure that rewards a biblical stand, stand against this.
Sure.
Like one of the best ways that parents can actually really even proof their children against a lot of this cultural Marxism, of which transgenderism is but one iteration of this, is teach your children the scientific method early on. Like early on, from the time they're 2 or 3 years old, ingrain in your children cause and effect relationships.
Mm-hmm.
To teach them to be little scientists, because if you can integrate that in them, and like you're teaching logic, if you can integrate these skills in them, it becomes a lot more they have to kick against when they're faced with this ideology. And one of the reasons why they're so vicious and why they dogpile, why they cancel, is because they know that ideology is not steeped in truth, and it's easy to debunk. When you state truth, you don't have to grow defensive. And that's why I'm a very calm Christian where my beliefs are concerned, because I see the truth. I see an entire worldview that really supports God's thesis. And I see the consequence of embracing the antithesis, the antithesis. And for transgenderism, they know it's absurd, that you really can't change your gender just by a verbal mandate. And that's why they have to constantly be affirmed on their phone over and over and over again, because probably truly you take that affirmation away and they start swinging back into logic and reason again.
Sure.
So that'd be an interesting, I would love to see that study. I'm going to look that up.
You should do the study and then come back on and let's discuss it. I mean, I would think that because this is a social contagion, and if it's not true gender dysphoria, that would happen, because you can suppress the truth all you want, but it will end up resurfacing. You cannot deny it, because you can verbally deny it. You could try to ignore it, but it will not go away. And that's what I actually heard someone say that a week ago, 2 weeks ago on another podcast, was saying they continually have to be affirmed, because when it's them and their thoughts, they realize I'm not, I might have changed my body. I might have taken these, hormone blockers, but I still don't feel the way I thought I was going to.
Absolutely.
So,
And,
yeah,
Marxism always promises this utopia.
yeah,
And the word utopia means, I think it means like no man's land, or I think it refers to a place that does not exist.
yeah,
So Marxism, no matter its form, whether it's economic Marxism or the gender thing, critical race theory, it doesn't matter. It always promises some future utopia. And the biggest opponents right now of surgeries on minors are these women. It's largely women, and Walter Heyer, a man. These people have followed that utopia all the way to the end of the road. And they have realized, after all these surgeries, after the double mastectomy, the phalloplastic surgery, the hormones, after all of this, these women come to terms with truth, and they say, I just am not a man, no matter what I've done. And what's interesting is that for these transgender people who have come to the truth, and they're detransitioning or they're desisters, for these people, they have seen the truth, and their bodies are mangled. They, by their own words, they say they're going to be freaks for the rest of their lives. But these people, they don't kill themselves because they've come to see truth. But for on that pathway, they're so fragile that if the doctor refuses the surgery, they're going to kill themselves. I mean, they're so fragile on the road to utopia.
mm-hmm.
But when they come to the end of that road and realize utopia truly is a place that doesn't exist, for a lot of them, they're finding strength, in speaking out against this.
Yeah.
And they're the most tragic stories. They're just the most tragic stories.
Yeah. They were the sacrifice for the culture today, really. And that's
Yes,
the sad reality. Yeah.
yes, they are.
Emily, this podcast, I mean, this episode has been amazing, and I appreciate you sharing your wealth of information and your knowledge. We're going to have you on again. I know that you and I were talking. Yeah. I mean, it's been so, I think equipping, making sure these are hard conversations to have. They're hard realities of what our culture is facing, but we are parents in the midst of this culture. God has placed us here for this time because he knows with him, we can stand on the truth, and we can take a stand for our kids and for the ones who are innocent. Where can we read some of the articles that you've published and find some of your work?
I would encourage everybody who is watching this to go on the Salvo's website. And even if you just Google Salvo Magazine, and maybe I don't know if in your description, can you put a link to okay, that'd be great.
Yep.
If you go there, you will find a lot of free articles online. We have excellent writers that write for Salvo, and every article that we submit does undergo an editorial review. I mean, our editors are amazing people, and they, we don't engage in polemics against the culture, raging polemics. We just really expose a lot of what is happening in the culture, and we offer biblical commentary on it. And I would encourage and become a subscriber. So Salvo comes out. I happen to have one right here.
Awesome.
Salvo comes out 4 times a year, and the magazine, the print edition does, and it's a beautiful layout, full graphics. And listen, ladies, admittedly, I know the articles are hard to read. They oftentimes, I found out from Terrell when you were actually talking to Terrell that 60% of our subscribers are men.
Oh, wow.
And I understand that because it's hard as a mom to read these articles and see what is happening. But I would encourage you, force yourself to do it.
Yes.
So that you are equipped to manage what's going on in your kid's life, or that child that is in that youth group. Just be prepared to help out other parents. who are going through the wars that are in our culture right now. So thank you, Shanda, for letting me put that plug in. I love Salvo. Salvo is absolutely fearless in the topics that they tackle. Black Lives Matter, as early as the first month after the George Floyd killing, we were putting articles out there telling people, don't jump on the bandwagon here. With Black Lives Matter. I mean, our writers were on top of this. And so I would really encourage, people to go online and take a look at the articles.
Absolutely. And I'm going to have more of Salvo's writers on because you guys do tackle so many great topics. Oh my gosh, it's amazing. And it's Salvo for you guys listening, Salvo Magazine. You can go online. I love getting the hard copies because I like to learn and write and put, highlight and things like that. So go online, you can read them there. You can get both the hard copy and the online version. But like, Emily was saying, there are free things online too, free articles. Again, learning and acquiring knowledge is an active activity. So you have to activate the mind and have to be purposeful and intentional. But if you want to know what's happening, which as Christians, that's also our responsibility, to keep our finger on the pulse of culture and to give good, solid answers that lead people back to the truth, Salvo is going to be one of your great resources. I'll have all those links in the show notes. If you have any questions for me, you can email me at hello@shandafulbright.com, and I'll catch you on the next one.